going to tell you in a second why I'm so thirsty. The last time I came here was to meet Allison for lunch, and my luncheon was at 1 o'clock, and I was meeting her and Gabe, and at 2:45 I was supposed to meet my brother, and there's this bus that I take from West Covina, where I live, and the only way I was going to make that bus and be here on time is if I jumped over this certain dividing wall at the end of my street. And so I looked over the wall, and it looked perfectly dry. And so there was this little tree there. It was like fate had put this little tree there just so I could get over this wall. And there was no way I was going to make the bus unless I jumped over the wall. So I jumped over the wall, and it was like jumping into quicksand. And so I had mud like up to my ankles, and anyhow, I didn't learn my lesson. I'm not muddy today, but because I jumped into a dry spot, but I did. I jumped over the wall again today, and that's why I'm here on time. Oh, and Allison actually asked me to say hello to everyone from Arkansas. I lived in Arkansas for 7 years. I think of that as my childhood home. Oh, ladies, I was just sitting next to you. And my father lived there for 40 years, so I visited there many times, and I'm intimately familiar with the Ozarks, and I think it's one of the most beautiful places really in the country. And I also wanted to comment on the honor and privilege of meeting one of the giants of Japanese American history, Art Hansen. We've emailed, but we've never had the opportunity to meet. Okay. And was there something else? That was it. Okay. When I first started writing for children, I asked someone what was considered an historical novel for kids. I was told, anything before the 1980s. By that standard, every novel that I write for Simon & Schuster will be historical. I'm going to talk mainly about my writing process and answer specific questions Allison suggested I address. All of this, by the way, is particularly interesting to me because I'm currently writing an author's note about oral histories and about diverging from the facts for my upcoming book about the Vietnam War. One question Allison suggested I address was, how do you use factual information in writing fiction? For my Vietnam book and for Wheat Flour, I read as much as I could about the subject matter and interviewed as many people as I felt I needed. I found contradictions and disagreements in all of this, in part because each person experiences life and even the exact same experience differently. A police officer I know said that multiple witnesses to a crime can be virtually useless, not because they're lying, but because they experience the crime so differently. Through reading thousands of pages and interviewing dozens of people, I've learned that history is not static, but as alive as the present is. For me, the only way to write an historical novel is to develop your characters and stick unyieldingly to their points of view. You make your stand. When I wrote Kira Kira, I thought of it as writing from the point of view of a certain girl. In other words, I can't write to or for, but only from. During the writing of Wheat Flour, one woman I interviewed vehemently wanted me to use the phrase concentration camp in the book. But I said the characters probably would not have used that phrase. She got perturbed and said, that's what they were, concentration camps. But in writing historical fiction, it doesn't matter what the camps were, it matters what the characters would have called them. There are facts that are, of course, undeniably facts, but even some of those facts are subject to question. For instance, my Vietnam book is about the dogs who were brought in country to sniff out booby traps for the soldiers. I learned it was a fact that because the dogs were so effective, the Viet Cong offered a bounty for the tattooed ears of these dogs. But in my reading and interviewing, I heard that the bounty ranged from virtually nothing to $25,000. Since the bounty was fact, I mentioned it, but I was vague about the amount. Another way to have handled that would have been to have two different characters perceive the bounty as different amounts. And like the woman who wanted me to use concentration camp, one Vietnam interviewee became rather perturbed when I wouldn't use his figure. Allison also asked me, how has your book been received by young readers? The answer to that depends, of course, on the reader. Kita Kita is about a young girl who dies of lymphoma. One group of children responded by assisting and participating in a leukemia and lymphoma society. I also noticed there are two kinds of positive responses from kids. One deals with issues. These letters and emails will list what the children learned about racism, about Japanese Americans, about working conditions, etc. A social worker who works with families in which one of the children are dying wrote me to say she uses the book, in her work with children, though I have not received any mail from children about this issue. The other kind of positive response I receive is nearly purely emotional. The children put themselves in the place of the characters. They simply feel the book and relate it to their own lives. They experience the book. For instance, here are some quotes from letters I've received. Reading about Katie and Len fighting made me think about me and my sisters fighting. It makes me really regret ever fighting with my sisters. Your book has changed my life by a lot. For the rest of these, each of these sentences is from a different child. I have been through a lot of death in my life, and I can relate to this book and Katie. I cried and cried throughout the whole thing. When I read this book, it felt so real and hard to be in Katie's place. This book made me experience a great deal of sorrow and a tremendous amount of happiness all at once. I think I cried because at the same time I was reading, I imagined my oldest sister Elaine died along with Lynn, and I could just feel Katie's pain. And my personal favorite, even though I am a boy, your book was extremely moving. Allison also asked, as I understand the question, how do you choose when to diverge from the facts? The answer to that is simple. The story determines when and where you diverge. In Wheat Flour, which is based very heavily in fact, I made up one place entirely, the San Carlos racetrack, which I used for an assembly center. There is no such place. But I made it up so that I could use facts from different assembly centers and put them into one place. I also diverge from the facts if the pacing of the book feels off. I may need to change a minor date here and there to keep the book moving.